So, what I'm going to talk to you a little bit today is about how the future requires safety. So, my name is Gitte. I am native wired on Twitter, and I do tweet a lot, at least sometimes. And my pronouns is she and her. Like Katie said, I'm an agile coach. I am more on the people side than I am on the technical side, which is like that's why I often use this tree hugger thing, because some people say that it's about hugging trees. I think this is the only tree I actually hugged. And the cool thing about people is they actually hug back. I'm also a speaker. I speak at a bunch of conferences. And I recently started as engineering manager and coach at Mentimeter. This is my first manager role, and I am still trying to figure out all that it means. But what I do know it means, it's a lot about helping the people that I manage, help them grow and find their way and in whatever thing they are doing. Like Hedi said, I also organized the Agile Coach Camp. We do hope we can go back to Rückersbach next year, but we didn't feel safe enough to do it this year. We really miss being in Rückersbach. And the German Agile community was the first time where I met people who were like me. People who believe we could make the world better by helping people get better workplaces. And not just that, helping people get better in general. And that made a big difference for me. And I didn't realize what it actually meant until years later. But the fact that I found a place where I belonged, where it was okay to be who I was, is part of what transformed me, as one of my friends, Alexis, says, into becoming who I have always been, but who I was not daring to be because I wanted to fit into the world. So today I'm going to talk to you about leaders, and I'm going to talk to you about psychological safety. So the theme of this conference is the future. And I was looking up links about how uncertain the future is. And I found this one, which is from Abraham Lincoln, maybe. I mean, if he said all the stuff that is contributed to him online, he has been busy speaking. But he talks about the best way to predict the future is to create it. And while I think this sounds really nice, I also think that we have more challenges today doing that than we had when Abraham Lincoln was living. Søren Kierkegaard, who's a Danish philosopher, or was a Danish philosopher, said this: life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. So that's the thing about the future, is we can only truly understand it once it happened, but we do need to live it going forward. And that's one of the reasons why it can be hard to create the future, because we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how the things that we do are going to affect the future. We can have an idea about it, but we can't see the result until afterwards. So one of the things that has been talked about a lot is that companies are VUCA. And it took me a long time to actually remember what it was about. But the thing is that when we had the big oil crisis in 1973, things started changing faster than expected. All of a sudden, we had a world where things were not as predictable as we thought they would be. And in 2001, the US military started talking about VUCA, which means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So this is the world that we live in. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of complexity. It's very volatile, which, as far as I understand the word, means that things might disappear fast. And it's very ambiguous. So what all this kind of leads to is that it's really hard for us to figure out exactly what we need. Whether we are working with programming languages, we can't tell what is the programming language we're going to need in 5 years. Or we work in healthcare, where we're still in the middle of a pandemic that some people have said, yes, this pandemic will be coming, but we didn't know exactly what would be coming. So the problem with this is that we don't know what we're going to need in the future, because we don't know what the future is going to bring. And while we can create some of it, we cannot create all of it, and we definitely can't understand it. So to be able to live and prepare for the future, we need learning. We need organizations that are learning. We need people that are learning. We need innovation, and we need resilience. So we need to build these things, and then we can live in the future or be prepared for the future. Because if we have these things, if we have that resilience that allows us to go into crisis and then get out of it without being too damaged, if we have a learning organization where we learn depending on what's happening, and if we have that innovation, then our companies will be those of the future. And what this really requires is great leaders and great teams, because these things that we are looking at, learning, innovation, resilience, is all about people. And we have people, well, I'm just going to rewind. We are going to need these learning, innovation, and resilience. And what this is about, it's about people. People are the ones learning, people are the ones innovating, people are the ones that need to be resilient. So first, I'm going to look a little bit into the leaders. So this part is something that is taken partly from a different talk that I did together with Lena Pagan. So that's why I put her Twitter ID on here as well. If we look at traditional leadership, and I'll just pre-warn that the next part is going to be a little bit stereotyping for the sake of explaining it. But if we look at what is a traditional leader, the way we see a leader, and actually if you ask kids to, or even grown-ups to explain what a leader is, these are often the things that come out. It's about being powerful. It's about being dominant, making decisions, having authority, handling the resources that we have, whether those are people or computers or whatever it is. It's a manager, and it's someone that's really confident. It is kind of a power position. Whereas if we look at what Lena and I call modern leadership, it's a little bit like comfort. It's about caring about people. It's about empowering people. It's about autonomy oriented around people. It's about self-governing, and it's about information flowing, which all of these are more on the softer side, so to say. Not that they're easier, but they're on the softer side. And the interesting part is that if we look at how things are run today, we kind of have both. So we have the kind of powerful leaders who just tell people what to do. And we have the softer leaders who care a lot about people, but who might be afraid to set clear expectations. And it's a little bit like we have the two sides kind of saying that the other one doesn't work. So we have people from the power side saying, well, it's just these soft hippies and nothing gets done. We have the softer side saying, well, the managers don't look at people. They're very... So we have this rift where both sides are talking about the other part doesn't work. And I think, this is based on stuff that both Lena and I have seen in a lot of different organizations, that we tend to see these two kinds of leaders, and they are not totally willing to learn from each other. What you sadly see in many other situations in life is we have two sides that are not learning from each other. But really, if we want to go to the future, we need to bridge this rift. We need to get the best of both sides. Because, as stereotyping again, if we have traditional leadership, we have a little bit like do as you're told, telling people what to do and just expecting them to do it. Whereas one of the parts that we can use from traditional leadership would be setting the direction. This is where we are going. And if we look at the other side, one of the things that we have often seen in modern leadership is a little bit do whatever. We have autonomous teams, which means they can do whatever. But if we look at autonomous teams and what autonomous really means, it means do something within a frame. And while it sounds really nice that we can do whatever comes with a cost. It comes with the cost that there are a lot of options. We do not have a limited area that we can work within. And one of the things that a modern leader can do is help figure out how people can self-govern within the frame that we set. And I know this is very stereotypical, but the thing about stereotypical, it helps us understand the world, and there's usually some truth to it. But really, if we look at the future of leadership, we need both. We do need the power, but we also need the care. So we need to have this balance where if we look at the things that we want from traditional leadership, we want to bring the growth, we want to bring the power, we want to bring the visions and the expectations. So setting clear expectations, stating these to people doesn't mean we cannot be challenged, but it does mean that as leaders, we need to set these things. And if we look at the more modern style or the caring style, we do need that caring. We need true caring about people. We need a leader that can help people gain autonomy. And we need leaders that have empathy and that are willing to be vulnerable. And all of these things are things that come from so-called modern leadership. So by combining these two, we kind of take the best of two worlds. But we do need both. And it can be really hard because one of the experiences I've had, for instance, with leaders from the right side and from the more caring side is that they're a little bit afraid to set expectations not because they don't have expectations, but because they don't want to push the people too much. They don't want to go into micromanagement and telling people what to do. And because they don't want to do that, they pull back too much. And I think that's often what we do is when we want to have one thing, we swing too much to one side. Whereas with most things, we need to find that balance. An example of a really good leader from the modern leadership, Martin Florian, that I worked with, was that he struggled setting expectations. He struggled saying, I expect this of you. And his reason was the thing about micromanagement. But people needed these expectations. If we don't have expectations, we're just going to guess. So what Martin says is, I keep forgetting that I role model more than I assume. Without clear expectations, I create wrong implicit expectations. So if we, as a caring leader, don't state expectations or visions, then people are going to guess. And we are not very good at guessing what other people are thinking. So to be able to have that leader of the future, we need both sides. So now we know how to create great leaders. How hard can it be? We just find the balance. We will be looking a little bit at great teams. So when we talk about great teams, the thing that a lot of people refer to in the IT industry is actually high-performing teams. We want teams who are very high-performing. And in 2012, Google created Project Aristotle that looked into what are the things that are common for all the teams that are high-performing. The first things that they looked at and the things that they expected to find would be like, what is the level of expertise in the team? What kind of skills do they have? What kind of education do they have? Do we have more PhDs? Then they're probably more high performing. And what they found was that it didn't look like any of these things made a significant difference. So they went back and looked at things from a different angle. And they found these 5 things to be the 5 things that matter for high-performing teams, and that the one that matters most of all is psychological safety. So psychological safety is about bringing what you know to work, bringing who you are to work, and not being afraid to speak up. Meaningful work is about knowing that the work that you are doing right now actually gives meaning. So you are working on something that helps people in one way or another, for instance, or that creates awesome technical software. It depends on what people find meaningful. And I actually see this as a small trend in our industry, maybe because we are now, at least in the Western world, at a point where we can start looking a little bit beyond we need pay to make sure we eat, we have a place to live. Or maybe just because the people that I surround myself with are getting older as well as I am. Because when I came out from university, I was just happy to get a job. And when I look at it now, I probably wouldn't have worked in that organization because they create military software. They didn't create software that had any weapons in it, but they created software that would tell you where your troops were. And even though that is not weaponized, that is still part of what armies use in war or in any other kind of situation. So today, I would probably not have worked there because I don't just look to get a job. I look to get a meaningful job, a job where I know that what I'm working on can actually make a difference. Another thing was dependability. Did the team actually deliver what they said, or did they speak up about not delivering if they were late? It was about having structure and clarity. So having a structure in the teams, having that clarity of what your role is and how you fit into the team. And then impact of work, knowing that the work that you do actually have an impact. And if we look at some of these, it actually fits very well into some of the things that we have in Agile, at least if we look back to some of the original values. Being dependable, actually working together and having that dependability and telling your team and your surrounding what's going on, and also taking that responsibility to step up and say, you know what, we're late. Not just the day before we deliver, but stepping up when we actually see that this is happening. We have that structure and clarity. While we don't want too much, we still want some structure and clarity. And while there are still some myths that Agile is do whatever, actually requires a lot of discipline to function. So the fact that Google started looking into this and talking about psychological safety created kind of a little bit of a wave into our industry where a lot of places are now looking into psychological safety. You can say, interesting enough, it might not be all places in Google that has proper psychological safety, but that does not make the result any less significant. It just means they have more work to do, which we all do. The interesting part about these things is that psychological safety is not something new. I discovered it in 2017, and I think a lot of people discovered it over the last 5 to 9 years when Google started talking about it. But actually, the first mentioning of psychological safety that I found is from 1965, where Shine and Bennett were looking into how do we make a good learning environment? And what they realized is that to be able to learn, you need to be a little bit uncomfortable. You need to be pushed a little bit out of your comfort zone. And the big conclusion that they made was that to be able to learn, you need an environment that's psychologically safe. Because if you don't have an environment where you feel safe, what happens is that you panic a little bit. You become a little bit nervous. And that's not a good environment for learning. So that's the first mentioning that I found of it. And if we look into the 90s, we have Kahn and Edmondson looking into what does this mean in a modern organization? What does it mean when we have organizations that's really about solving problems? So this is not something new, but I think it's something that is new that we have focused on, especially in the IT industry. But also, if we look out in the rest of the world, in the other industries, you see more and more focus on the psychological safety. So if we look at the IT industry, we have the Google project from 2012. We have modern Agile that talks about making safety a prerequisite. And I truly believe this, that we need that safety to be able to make good Agile organizations, but good organizations in general. So this is the definition that I use the most. I switch a little bit between Amy Edmondson's and William Kahn's one, but I like this the most. Psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequence of self-image, status, or career. And basically this means that you are not afraid to be yourself or to use whatever part of yourself you have, whether that is a curiosity or knowledge you have or ideas. You are not afraid of doing this. And what I also like is that this actually talks about self-image, status, or career. Because sometimes when we talk about psychological safety, we talk about Boeing, for instance, where people who complained about, what was it, the 776, the one that fell down, just say it that way, the ones complaining about that got fired or bullied. And while we sometimes talk about that fear of being fired, which to some people might mean that they struggle paying their rent, that they won't eat. I'm lucky enough to be in a country where I would still eat. But we do have that. But actually just losing your status, having people make fun of you, for instance, that creates unsafety as well. And I find this very interesting that we have things that from a high level point of view are very different, being fired, not being able to eat, or having people make fun of you. In our brain, it doesn't make that difference. Those things to us are still dangerous. So basically, it's about doing things without being afraid of being punished. What is also interesting about that is that it's inside people's head. You can be in a company or a team where you would never ever be made fun of. But if you are afraid of this, you can still feel psychologically unsafe. Another part of safety that I find a lot of people forget is that safety does not necessarily mean comfort. Actually, safety can be the feeling that you are able to be uncomfortable. When we talk about making mistakes at work or suggesting things, that is not always going to be comfortable. Let's say you do something as a developer, for instance, that breaks the whole system. We saw something recently, who was it, where an intern took a whole system down. But it needs to be safe. It needs to be something we can talk about. It needs to be something we can learn from, and not something that we are punished for. If you come up with an idea that's not like everyone else's ideas, that can be uncomfortable, especially if you're new in an organization. But that's okay, because it's okay to be uncomfortable as long as it is safe. But it's very important to remember that those things are not always the same. We do need that comfort sometimes. We need to step out of our comfort zone to learn, to innovate, to create. But we also need to step back into our comfort zone and get rest. So how will psychological safety help us? This is from Amy Edmondson, who I think is the the most important and most interesting of the researchers working on psychological safety at the moment. And she talks about this will help us ask questions, admit mistakes, offering ideas and challenging norms, which means that all of this will help us learn. It will help us innovate. And the admitting mistakes and finding that ability to be uncomfortable is also part of what will make us resilient. And when you look at these things, they look like, sure, of course we can do this. Of course, asking questions, that's a given. Everyone can ask questions. But one of the things that I've experienced over time is that stating explicitly it is okay to ask questions is something that makes a big difference. So I'm starting, like I said, I just started being a manager, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do. And one of the things that I talked with my first employee with is, or my employee, we call them LMEs in my organization, but I'm not sure I like that term. So my first direct report with was, I don't want you to sit with something that you can't figure out for long. It's fine that you sit and try out things, but I would like you to ask for help. And when I had my second one-on-one with this person, they said, it was so helpful that you said that to me, because being a trainee in this organization, I still found that it was easy to ask questions. And there are so many people who want to help me. So we do need to state these things explicitly, and we do need to make sure that they exist in our organization. And Amy also talks about it. She talks about how sometimes we just stay quiet because we are afraid that other people will think we're ignorant if we ask questions. The first time I was helping an organization introduce psychological safety, that was one of the problems we ran into, was that the senior developers were afraid to ask questions because they felt like, I should know this. I've been in this organization for so long, I should know this. But the thing is, if we don't know it, we don't know it. We can't remember everything. Maybe you haven't looked at this for a year. Our brain doesn't keep all information. So being able to ask questions is something that is very helpful. Admitting mistakes instead of hiding them in fear of looking incompetent. This is actually the first research that Amy Edmondson did on this was at hospitals, where she looked into how many medical mistakes are there in different departments. And what she found was that it seemed like the ones with the best working environment had the most medical mistakes. And it was almost like you could kind of put up a statistic about it. So she had a research assistant go in and help do the experiment again. And what they realized was that in the departments where there was not a good working environment, they were hiding their mistakes. They were hiding the medical mistakes because they were afraid of what would happen to them. Whereas in the where they had good work department, I'm going to start again. In the departments where they had good working environments, people admitted their mistakes and looked at them, because we all make mistakes. And if we don't have a good environment, we are going to hide these. And then sometimes they will come out at the worst moment. They're offering ideas. Sometimes we hold back because we're afraid we are intrusive. But I'm the only one with this idea. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just going to butt into something that people know a lot more than I do. But we do need these ideas. We need those things that totally don't fit into the situation, because sometimes those are the ideas that give us true innovation. And again, the challenging norm, sitting back because we don't want to look negative. We don't want to be the one who goes in and says, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And people are not going to like us because we look negative. And of course, these things are, for instance, challenging norms is something that we need to do in a kind way. We need to work on our language. But we do need an environment where we can go in and where we can do all these things. So in the book that Amy Edmondson wrote, Fearless Organization, she talks about different elements where people as a big term, challenge, can we have psychological safety and performance? Or can we have psychological safety and I've got the other things. I will get back to you on that. So she went in and she looked at each of these elements that people challenge and talk about why it is important and how psychological safety actually kind of work together with these things. It's not two opposites. It is something where we can go in and we can benefit from this. So if we look at the safety being high or low, and we look at low standards and high standards of performance. And when she talks about standards of performance, she does not only mean those of the organizations. It's not just what they expect, what the organization expects of you. It is also what you expect of yourself. So if we look at a place that has low psychological safety and low standards of performance, internally and externally, we have the apathy zone. Not much happens here because we don't expect much of ourselves. The organization doesn't expect much. And there is no safety. So even if things are wrong, we are not going to speak up about it. This is probably one of the worst places to be. Sadly, I have been in organizations like this. If you have high standards for performance, whether those are internal or external, and you have low psychological safety, this is the anxiety zone. This is the place where we are afraid a lot of the time. And very often, in my experience, the standard of performance comes from the outside. So for me, those are a little bit connected to low psychological safety, that they come from the outside. But that's not something that is based on research. It's more my experience from being in organizations. And what happens in the anxiety zone is that we spend so much time being afraid because of who we are, what we think, that not much gets done, not much gets innovated here. Oh, sorry. Then we have the places where there is a high psychological safety, but the standards for performance are low, internally, externally. And this is a very nice place to be because it's very comfortable. We are not being challenged. We don't have high expectations. It's a nice place to be. The problem with this is that, again, not much happens here. So if we have really high psychological safety and we don't have high expectations of people, what often happens is we end up in the comfort zone. And while that is nice, that is not enough for us to be ready for the future and to be ready to be high performing. So where we really want to be in the modern organizations, at least in organizations where the work that we are doing is complex, it's not repetitive, we want to move in here. So looking at it from how much do we produce perspective, you don't need psychological safety if people are doing repetitive work. While it's nice to have, it's not necessary. If you look at it from a people perspective, of course we need it. But the thing is, if we have high standards internally, externally, and we have high psychological safety, this is where we dare push ourselves out of the comfort zone. This is where we really start learning, and this is where high performance exists. And that is where we want to be. That's where we want our organizations to be. And what this requires is that we have that safety and that we have the leaders. So if you look at the balance of the leaders, we need the caring part, we need the empathy part, we need the vulnerability part to be able to create this safety. And we need the power part, we need the expectations and the vision to be able to create that high standard for performance from the outside and help people create it from the inside. So we need that balance to be able to get into the learning zone, which is necessary for us to go into the future. So one of the things that we also talked about in the leadership is about vulnerability. And Amy Edmondson talks about 3 things you can do as a leader to go in and help people feel more safe. One is frame things as learning. That what we are working on right now is actually learning, because we haven't done this before, and we are not producing things, we are learning things, and products come out of this, but it is a learning process. Be curious. So be curious what people are talking about, listen to them, ask questions. If somebody makes a mistake, instead of blaming them, talk about, oh, that's interesting, what made you choose this thing instead of that thing, for instance. Curiosity is also a really good thing when you have discussions with people. And the last thing is show fallibility, which means also show your mistakes as a leader. And that's where the vulnerability part comes in, because as a leader, showing your problems is, and that you make mistakes just like everyone else, is actually showing vulnerability. And not everyone likes this. And I think that the way we have conditioned a lot of our, especially high-level managers today, is to not show that vulnerability. A lot of organizations, especially big, old organizations, you have not come to the top by showing you are vulnerable. You have come to the top by showing that you can overcome everything and that you can win. And that's, I think, is something that we need to change to be able to create more flexible, more learning, more resilient organizations and help create resilient people. So this means that if we have high psychological safety, it actually leads to the learning part. It leads to innovation and it leads to great teams. And I believe it also leads to resilience, because if you are in a good team where you can speak up about things, where you can make mistakes, slowly you can start building your resilience. You can start getting better at meeting problems. But it does require having that safety, whether it is in a team or an organization. And everyone contributes to safety or to removing safety. So it's not just enough to have leaders who create safety. If you have team members who will go like, what were you thinking? That's stupid, for instance. That is something that can break safety really fast. So all of us need to contribute to these things to create this kind of organizations. So wrap up, we don't know the future. And while I think we kind of all logically know this, I think that the last 2 years have really shown us how we totally don't know the future. How right now it feels like you can't plan a month ahead because you don't know what's going to happen. We need learning organizations, we need good leaders, and we need good teams. We also need more independent ones, because we need people who can actually move around in organizations, make decisions without having to go through 7 chains to go in and and make a decision. We do need that psychological safety, because that's going to help us have people feel safe enough to make decisions on their own, to be autonomous, to take that responsibility and own up to it. And it can take a lot of time, and it's hard to build that safety. And it takes a continuous effort, but it is totally worth it. So we need good teams, good leaders, and psychological safety. I will send these slides to Sebastian or Hedy afterwards, and you can get them. I just need to add a few more links, because I added a few more slides yesterday. There's also the contact information of me in there, so feel free to ask me questions there if you don't feel like asking me questions here. Or just stay in touch with me. I love being in touch with people.